the name he wouldn't say out loud. In public, Bernard Montgomery sold certainty like a weapon. Clipped sentences, immaculate confidence, the promise that this time the Eighth Army would not be bullied across the desert. He cultivated an image of control, of a commander who planned, prepared, and then struck on his own terms. Yet behind the speeches and communiques sat a colder calculation. Erwin Rommel was the one opponent who could not be treated as routine. Rommel's power was tempo, hitting first, moving fast, forcing reactions, turning uncertainty into panic before a staff map could even be updated. By the time Montgomery took command in 1942, Rommel had become more than a general. He was a pressure that lived inside British headquarters, a legend that had already shaken confidence, exhausted commanders, and convinced too many men that defeat could arrive overnight. Montgomery would never announce fear. His authority depended on refusing it, but his behaviour would show respect that bordered on dread. The insistence on preparation, the refusal to be lured into a hasty battle, the determination to deny Rommel the one thing he fed on, British improvisation under stress. And that is the question at the heart of this story. Not whether Montgomery admired Rommel as an enemy, but whether the victory he later celebrated began as a battle to master what Rommel did to mines long before he was beaten on the sand. Two reputations built before the desert. Montgomery did not arrive in North Africa as a romantic cavalryman chasing glory. He arrived as a professional product of the British Army's hard lessons, methodical, stubborn, deeply concerned with morale and cohesion, and convinced that discipline and preparation could substitute for improvisation when lives were at stake. His career had forged him into a commander who valued control, of timing, of information, of the emotional temperature of the troops. Rommel, by contrast, had become famous for the opposite kind of power, the ability to create decisive moments out of disorder. In France, in 1940, his rapid armoured thrusts helped build the legend of speed and audacity. In North Africa, from 1941 onward, he turned scarcity into momentum, exploiting Allied hesitation, striking along fragile supply routes, and making opponents feel that the front line could dissolve at any hour. Both men understood reputation as a battlefield tool, but they used it differently. Montgomery broadcast calm certainty to steady an army that had been shaken, while Rommel projected unpredictable aggression to keep enemies off balance. And when these reputations collided in the desert, it wasn't simply a contest of tactics, it was a contest of methods and nerves, because Montgomery's entire approach depended on preventing the very kind of chaos in which Rommel had made his name. Next, North Africa becomes a theatre of fear and myth. The desert magnified everything, distance, speed, and uncertainty, until war became as psychological as it was mechanical. There were few natural barriers, no comforting forests or cities to slow an advance. Instead, an army could appear on the horizon like a moving storm, and a mistake could stretch for hundreds of miles before it could be corrected. Supply lines were lifelines drawn across open sand, and every fuel truck, every water convoy, every repair unit mattered as much as the tanks themselves. In that environment, commanders did not only fight each other, they fought the clock, the horizon, and the fear of being outmaneuvered into emptiness. Rommel's methods fit the desert like a key fits a lock. Sudden thrusts, feints that created panic, and relentless pressure that forced opponents to make decisions before they were ready. The British, battered by earlier reverses, began to treat him as an unavoidable force, less a man than a phenomenon, until the desert fox became a myth that could unsettle a unit before a shot was fired. Montgomery understood something many leaders pretend not to, that myth is a weapon, and an army that believes it is already half defeated. So before he could break Rommel's formations, he would have to break the spell of Rommel's name, because in North Africa, morale and perception were as real as armour thickness and artillery range. Next, 1941 to 42. The Eighth Army's bruises and the Rommel shock. Before Montgomery ever faced Rommel directly, the Eighth Army had been conditioned by a cycle of disruption that Rommel exploited with ruthless consistency. sudden offensives that turned into retreats, confident plans that collapsed under pressure, and command changes that signalled to the troops that even the top could not find a stable answer. In early 1941, Rommel arrived in Libya and quickly demonstrated the desert's brutal truth. That initiative mattered more than neat front lines, driving the British back in a series of blows that made the war feel like a chase rather than a contest. The seesaw continued through 1941 and into 1942, culminating in moments that left scars on British confidence, including the fall of Tobruk in June 1942, a shock that landed not just on the map but in the mind of every soldier who heard the news. By the time Montgomery was appointed to command in August 1942, he inherited more than an order of battle. He inherited a shaken institution, an army that had learned to expect the ground to shift beneath it whenever Rommel moved. That lingering expectation, the belief that disaster could arrive with speed and surprise, was precisely the internal enemy Montgomery had to defeat before he could defeat the external one. Montgomery takes command and immediately rebuilds for one enemy. When Montgomery arrived to take over the Eighth Army in August 1942, he did not begin by promising clever maneuvers or daring raids. He began by changing the emotional physics of the army. He tightened discipline, clarified roles, and projected a certainty that was designed as much for exhausted nerves as for enemy intelligence. His first message was blunt in effect: the retreating stops here. He would not gamble the army in a hurried counterstroke, not because he lacked aggression, but because he understood the pattern Rommel wanted: the opponent who feels compelled to act fast, who attacks before fuel, ammunition, and coordination are ready, and who then collapses when the enemy's tempo fractures their plan. Montgomery's refusal to be rushed was not passivity. It was a shield against Rommel's strongest weapon. He demanded preparation, stockpiling, and a coherent defensive posture, and he reorganized the battlefield in his mind as a trap rather than a race. That choice reveals the hidden admission. He believed Rommel could still do it again, still outthink a staff, still punch through confusion, still turn a British mistake into miles of retreat. So Montgomery's early decisions were about removing the possibility of panic from the equation, because he knew that in the desert, fear travelled faster than tanks, and Rommel had made a career of riding that fear straight into an enemy's weak points. Alam Halfa, the test Montgomery couldn't afford to fail. The first true measure of Montgomery's approach came not in a grand offensive, but in a deliberately chosen restraint at Alam Halfa in late August and early September 1942. Rather than seeking immediate revenge for earlier defeats, Montgomery anchored his forces on strong ground, fortified his flanks, and prepared to let Rommel strike first, because he believed he understood how Rommel thought under pressure. Rommel did attack, driving hard in a flanking move that had undone British armies before, but this time the trap held. Fuel shortages slowed the German advance, Allied air power punished exposed columns, and prepared defences absorbed the blow without breaking. For Montgomery, Alam Halfa was not merely a tactical success. It was psychological proof that Rommel could be contained if his rhythm was denied. Yet the caution behind the victory spoke volumes. Montgomery did not pursue recklessly. He resisted the temptation to turn defence into instant glory, because he knew Rommel's greatest danger lay in the counterstroke that punished overconfidence. Alam Halfa showed the truth behind Montgomery's public composure. He respected Rommel enough to let him expend himself, enough to accept criticism for caution, and enough to delay celebration until the enemy's habits, not just his units, had been neutralized. Next, El Alamein, when caution becomes a weapon. By October 1942, Montgomery was ready to do what his predecessors had not: fight Rommel on a timetable of his own making, with overwhelming material superiority and no tolerance for improvisation. The Second Battle of El Alamein was built slowly and visibly: immense stockpiles of ammunition, fuel, and rations, careful coordination between infantry, armour, artillery, and air power, and a deliberate deception plan to disguise where and when the main blow would fall. Critics later mocked Montgomery's method as plodding, but that slowness was the point. He believed Rommel thrived when the British tried to match audacity with audacity, and so he chose instead to suffocate the enemy's options. Every barrage, every advance was meant to grind down resistance and deny the German commander the chance to regain initiative through surprise. Montgomery's fear was not of Rommel's courage or skill in battle, but of the chaos Rommel could still create if given space to maneuver. El Alamein was therefore an act of control as much as combat, a systematic refusal to allow the enemy's legend to dictate tempo. When the offensive finally broke through, it was because Montgomery had turned patience into a weapon, proving that discipline applied relentlessly could neutralize the very qualities that had once made Rommel terrifying. Next, the breaking point, the battle that ended the myth. The turning point at El Alamein was not a single cinematic moment, but a slow, brutal realization spreading through both armies that the old rules had changed. Montgomery's forces applied constant pressure, artillery pounding, infantry pressing forward, armour probing for gaps, until the Axis line began to fracture under exhaustion and attrition. Rommel's strength had always been movement, shifting, counterpunching, finding weakness, buying time with daring. But at El Alamein, the room to improvise shrank with every mile of restricted ground and every day of dwindling supply. When the breakthrough came and the Axis began to fall back, something larger than a tactical withdrawal occurred. The myth of inevitability cracked. The Eighth Army had been taught by experience to fear the sudden reversal, the moment when Rommel, even in retreat, might turn and strike with sharp cruelty. Montgomery understood that fear and refused to feed it. He pressed forward with determination, but without the reckless overreach that could invite catastrophe. In that balance lay the true victory. It was not only that Montgomery defeated Rommel's army, it was that he defeated the psychological pattern that Rommel had imposed on British command, the reflex to expect disaster, the habit of reacting rather than directing. After El Alamein, Rommel was still dangerous, still capable, but he was no longer a spell that ruled the room. Next. After Alamein. Why Monty still watched the ghost. Victory did not erase Montgomery's vigilance. If anything, it sharpened it. As the Axis forces retreated westward across Libya toward Tunisia, Montgomery advanced with purpose but without haste, resisting calls for dramatic encirclements that risked stretching supply lines and exposing flanks. To some observers, this caution seemed unnecessary now that Rommel had been beaten, but Montgomery understood the deeper danger. A wounded enemy commander with nothing to lose could still strike hardest of all. Rommel had escaped disaster before, slipping through narrow gaps, exploiting Allied overconfidence, and turning pursuit into sudden crisis. Montgomery therefore treated the retreat not as a chase, but as a controlled compression, tightening pressure, maintaining cohesion, and denying Rommel the disorder he needed to reverse momentum. His language and decisions revealed a commander who knew that fear does not disappear the moment the tide turns. It lingers as memory, warning against arrogance. Even as Rommel's forces weakened, Montgomery acted as though the ghost of earlier defeats still walked beside the army, reminding him that reputations die slowly. This was not insecurity, but discipline born of respect, a recognition that Rommel's greatest victories had come when his enemies believed the danger was already past. Next, what Montgomery admitted, without admitting it. In the years after the Desert War, Montgomery spoke often about El Alamein and the method that brought victory, framing it as the triumph of preparation over impulse, of order over gamble. Yet when he spoke of Rommel, his language was careful, measured praise, deliberate emphasis on the enemy's skill, and a repeated insistence that Rommel was a formidable opponent who had to be beaten the right way. This was not generosity for its own sake. By elevating Rommel, Montgomery implicitly explained his own caution, justifying the slow build-up and the refusal to chase quick victories. But between the lines, something else emerges, an acknowledgement that Rommel had shaped British behaviour long before Montgomery arrived, and that undoing that influence required as much psychological engineering as battlefield success. Montgomery never said he feared Rommel, because fear would undermine the very authority he had worked so hard to project. Instead, he reframed it as respect, professionalism, and realism. Yet the record of his decisions, the patience, the redundancy, the relentless control, suggests a commander who understood exactly how dangerous Rommel could be if given even a small opening. In that sense, Montgomery's post-war narrative was both honest and selective. He told the truth about how to win, while quietly leaving unsaid how much the enemy had forced him to think differently in order to do it. Next, the historian's verdict: fear, respect, or performance. When historians sift Montgomery's story, they rarely treat his public confidence as a transparent window into his private mind. They treat it as part of his command method, a deliberate performance designed to stabilize an army that had been psychologically battered. The documentary record, orders, timings, posture, the insistence on stockpiles and set-piece battle, shows a commander who acted as though one error against Rommel could still unravel everything, even when Montgomery had the advantage. Some scholars argue this is not fear in the simple sense, but an experienced recognition of what Rommel uniquely threatened, not mere casualties, but sudden operational collapse, fronts cracking, units retreating in confusion, morale breaking faster than defences. Others point out that Rommel's legend was amplified by propaganda on both sides, and that Montgomery, a master of reputation, benefited from defeating a mythic enemy. Praising Rommel afterward elevated the magnitude of his own achievement. The most persuasive verdict sits between extremes. Montgomery neither trembled nor dismissed. He managed risk with unusual seriousness because he believed Rommel's greatest weapon was psychological momentum. In that light, fear becomes a technical word, meaning not panic, but the disciplined refusal to underestimate a man who had already taught the Eighth Army what overconfidence could cost. Next. Back to the opening. The real reason he wouldn't say the name. Montgomery's greatness and his limitation both lived in the same place, his obsession with controlling the conditions of battle. Against many opponents, that habit could look like stubbornness or theatrical caution. Against Rommel, it became the antidote that the desert demanded. Because Rommel's true danger was never only the number of tanks he commanded or the miles he advanced. It was the effect he had on the decision-making of everyone facing him, the way he forced commanders to rush, to guess, to act before they were ready, to mistake motion for advantage. Montgomery understood that the army he took over had already been wounded by that pattern, trained to fear the sudden collapse, trained to believe Rommel could appear anywhere and turn confidence into retreat. So he waged two wars at once, a physical war of guns, fuel, and formations, and an invisible war against anxiety, rumour, and the legend that had become larger than the man. That is why, in the beginning, he could not afford to speak Rommel's name with anything but cold professionalism, because names can spread panic, and panic kills plans. And when the desert finally turned, when El Alamein broke the Axis line and the spell began to fade, Montgomery's victory was not just a triumph over an enemy commander. It was a victory over a psychological regime that had ruled British headquarters for too long. In the end, the fear he never admitted became the discipline that saved him, and the silence around Rommel's name became the proof that Montgomery had always known exactly what he was dealing with.